Spell armors have been part of fantasy lore for as long as there have been fantasy stories. The big, burly tank wears plate armor to protect themselves, and the robe-wearing mage relies on magic to protect them. In D&D, the spell Mage Armor reads, "You touch a willing creature who isn't wearing armor, and a protective magical force surrounds it until the spell ends." What this spell basically does is give a player who isn't wearing any armor equal to that of medium armor, like wearing leather or light mail. The spell armors for mages in WoW work in a similar vein, and have changed to do many different things throughout WoW's lifespan, with the constant of giving the mages extra defenses in one way or another. Frost armor in one of its earliest forms was a Lich ability in Warcraft 3, which when cast on a unit would slow the haste and movement speed of whatever attacked that unit. When the ability was carried over to WoW, it kinda kept the same effect. Frost armor was the first mage spell armor that mages could learn, as they got it right off the bat at level 1. And just like the Warcraft 3 version, it would make it so whoever attacked the mage while the armor was up would sometimes get a haste and movement speed debuff. In addition, Frost armor also gave the mage some extra armor, which was the only thing that increased with higher ranks of the spell. Frost armor was considered the lesser version of the icy armors, as later on while a mage was leveling up, they would get a new armor called Ice Armor, which was exactly like Frost armor in that it gave the mage extra armor and the slow debuffs, but in addition, it also gave a little bit of frost resistance. Once you learned Ice Armor, you no longer got new ranks of Frost Armor, so Frost Armor was pretty much exclusively a low-level mage ability only. Now, I'll be going over Ice Armor in more detail later on in this video, so I'll just leave it at that for now. Now, despite Frost Armor being like a defensive stance, so to speak, for mages, up until patch 2.4, or towards the end of the Burning Crusade, it could be dispelled. But to be fair, a lot of class armor type spells could be dispelled in early WoW, so that's not super surprising. Hell, until Legion, the Paladin's main cooldown Avenging Wrath could still be dispelled. In Wrath, Frost Mages had a talent where every time you chilled a target, you had a 15% chance to freeze them for 5 seconds. Freeze in this case was actually just a Frost Nova root, but still, this meant while you had one of the icy armors up, a mage could just passively root players who attacked them in melee. There were also glyphs to increase the armor granted by 50%, and another to increase its duration by 30 minutes. Although this was also back when glyphs gave legitimate DPS upgrades, so I can't really see a practical use for extra armor outside of maybe doing solo content, or if you're a PvPer, maybe. But to be fair, at least the 1 hour armors glyph was only a minor glyph, and most minor glyphs sucked or didn't give DPS boost, so it was probably used. In Cataclysm, Blizzard removed nearly all lower level abilities and ranks, and with this pruning they also merged Ice and Frost armor into a new armor called Frost Armor. Or I guess I should say they removed Ice Armor and added its effect to Frost Armor. And with this merger, Frost Armor now also provided a small resistance buff, in addition to its normal effect of increasing armor and applying a slow debuff to attackers. Then, one patch later, in patch 4.1, the frost resistance was removed. Such a shame. The armor labeled as Frost Armor only actually gave frost resistance for one patch in its lifetime. In addition to the frost resist change, it was also changed to reduce physical damage by 15% instead of granting a 20% armor boost. The haste slow was decreased from 25% to 20%, but now also affected range attack speed, or it finally affected hunters to be more precise. And then it was given its very own glyph. The Frost Armor glyph gave mages 2% of their maximum mana every 5 seconds, which wasn't very useful, seeing as Mage Armor at this time gave 3% mana every 5 seconds baseline. But I guess it could have been situationally useful in PvP or something, since Cataclysm was also Blizzard's first attempt to make DPS players not need to worry about mana anymore. Except for arcane mages, of course, because that's kind of their whole playstyle. And I say attempt because some DPS classes could still run out of mana. It just wasn't anywhere near as bad as it used to be, when Blizzard thought all mana classes needed to worry about managing their mana, instead of just healers and arcane mages like we have today. In Miss, Frost Armor was reworked again, and then went through a little tweaks to get the numbers right, but in its final version it was changed to no longer increase your armor nor slow attack speed, and instead would just increase your haste by 7% and slow attackers' movement speed only when attacked, in addition to having a 3-second cast time now, but lasts forever. The glyph of armors was changed at this time too, from increasing the duration of all armors by 30 minutes, to instead reducing the cast time of armors by 1.5 seconds, and increasing their defensive effects by 10%. The reason for the cast time addition to armors was to stop mages from armor swapping in PvP, and this is also when Blizzard was cutting down on stance dancing in general. Stance dancing, for those of you who probably didn't know, was a term used for swapping between long duration buffs or stances that are meant to be set before the battle and then not changed again. For example, it used to be warriors could only interrupt while in berserker stance, but warriors like to PvP in battle stance, so in order to interrupt, they would swap their stance to berserker stance to interrupt, and then swap back to battle stance for everything else. It was complicated gameplay that rewarded good players much more than the average player, and Blizzard didn't really like it, so they removed it all eventually. In Warlords of Draenor, it was changed again to be a passive ability that only Frost mages had, so you no longer even had the option to armor swap. And its haste was changed to give 8% multi-strike, a short-lived stat that only existed in WoD, which gave your abilities a chance to hit twice, with the second multi-hit only hitting for 30% normal damage, in addition to the normal movement speed slow on hit. In Legion, with the removal of multi-strike, it again just provided a haste buff, as well as just being a passive ability that slowed attackers, until it was finally removed from the game with patch 7.1.5, along with all other mage armors. And the movement slow on attack was instead just moved to Ice Barrier. Mages are once again unprotected. Now it's time to talk about Ice Armor. Ice Armor was the upgraded form of Frost Armor all the way up until Cataclysm. Back in the day, upgraded versions of spells being a completely different spell altogether was very common. You see, spells increased in power with spell ranks that you learned from trainers as you leveled up, and sometimes instead of learning a new rank, you got a new spell, and then all the future ranks will be added to that new spell only. So once you hit max level, it's not worth ever casting the lesser version of a spell, since it's still at the same level of power as back when you upgraded it, which basically just made it a dead spell in your spellbook. There's a reason they got rid of the system. It just unnecessarily created trap spells for new players, and just cluttered an already cluttered spellbook. In its first form, it was learned at level 30 and gave the exact same things as Frost Armor, more armor and a movement speed slow and haste slow to attackers, but in addition to frost resistance. Spell resistance were a much bigger deal in the earlier days of WoW, but frost resistance was never in very much high demand, so it wasn't as useful. Not to say it was useless. Yes, frost resistance was useful on the frost resistance boss in Naxxramas, and also Sindragosa and Wrath, and probably a few others I'm forgetting. I only say this because I always get comments about how I missed things when I make vague statements like that. Since the only thing Ice Armor gave over Frost Armor was frost resist and more armor, and since it was dispellable until TBC, I guess the use for Frost Armor could have been a cheap mana cost version to recast if all you cared about was the slow effect, since that part was identical. Because using rank 1 versions of spells for only the effect and not the damage or armor was very common back in the days. Like shamans using rank 1 Earthshock to interrupt, or frost mages using rank 1 Frostbolt to slow since it had a quicker cast time and a lower mana cost. As for the changes to the armor, pretty much all the changes for Frost Armor apply to Ice Armor, It was made undispellable at the tail end of TBC, and had 2 glyphs in Wrath to increase its armor and frost resistance by 50%, as well as a minor glyph that increased its duration by 30 minutes. Then in Cataclysm, when they removed ranks and lesser versions of spells, they merged Ice Armor into Frost Armor's effect, which basically just gave Frost Armor frost resistance, which they then removed from Frost Armor 1 patch later. Molten Armor was added to the game in the Burning Crusade, as an alternative mage spell armor to choose from over Frost Armor or Mage Armor. In its first form, it worked kinda like a Retribution Aura, or Thorns, and would cause damage to melee attackers each time they did damage to the mage. In addition, it gave the mage a crit buff, and reduced the chances of being crit by 5%, which was nearly the cap of uncritable by mobs and bosses, I might add. For those of you who don't know, tanks used to have to get at least 6% crit reduction in order to not be crit by mobs or bosses, which was absolutely necessary for every tank to obtain. So, at 5% is almost at that cap, but not quite. Not that mages could survive a non-crit hit from a boss anyway, but it was unique that they were almost uncrittable. Molten Armor also had a talent which allowed its damage to also proc off of ranged and spell attacks, which meant that fire mages at least could do damage back to all attackers and not just melee. But honestly, the damage it did was so minor, this was kinda a fluff interaction added onto a low-picked talent. Its Thorns-like effect damage was counted as direct damage, so it could proc abilities tied to direct damage, like the impact talent fire mages had, which changed over time, but basically always reset the cooldown of fire blasts, and sometimes would also add a stun to it, so it was a pretty good ability to proc. Its direct damage crits could also proc Ignite. Ignite was a fire mage ability, which basically turned any crit they did into a 4-second dot, which would do about 40% of that crit's damage as the dot's damage. Although some mages didn't like this interaction, since if it procced right before they got a polymorph cast off or something, the dot would break the CC. So they just added an exclusion to Molten Armor from Ignite, eventually. Then removed that exclusion in Wrath, and then re-added the exclusion again when people had the same problem in that expansion. Molten Armor, like all the other mage armors, was made undispellable in patch 2.4.3 towards the end of the Burning Crusade, when Blizzard finally started making a push to not have core defensive abilities be dispellable. In Wrath, its crit buff was changed to instead increase the critical strike chance of the mage equal to 35% of their spirit. You know, back when spirit was a stat, and also when that stat was a healer-only stat that was found on all kinds of caster gear. Blizzard tried many ways to make spirit a useful stat to casters, since it was on so much gear, until finally just giving up in Legion and removing it. And Molten Armor was one of the mage ways to turn spirit into a useful stat. They even had a glyph to increase the amount of spirit converted by 20%. So from 35% to 55% of your spirit would be converted into critical strike. In Cataclysm, it was changed again, in that it only gave a 3% increase to crit, instead of the spirit to crit conversion thing it had going on in Wrath, with the glyph changed as well, to increase its crit by just a flat 2%. So with the glyph, Molten Armor could give up to 5% more critical strike. And I should also probably mention at some point, fire mages are all about crit. If you could think of a poster boy for a stat, fire mages would be used as the crit representative. Everything they do revolves around crits and critting often, so a flat, passive increase to crit was always taken, and this armor was heavily used by fire mages, and even sometimes frost mages, in case its fiery aesthetic didn't tip you off. It also kept its thorns-like fire damage to attackers, and surprisingly, its 5% crit reduction to attackers. In Mist of Pandaria, just like with all the other mage armors, it was turned into a permanent buff that required a 3-second cast time. It was also given the passive 5% crit buff baseline without needing a glyph, and its 5% reduction chance to crit effect was finally removed and replaced with a 6% physical damage reduction instead. That 5% reduced crit chance reduction was probably the longest lasting effect from its original form. You know, in addition to the Fire Thorns effect, which was also removed at this time. Overall, kind of a net plus to the armor. The Fire Thorns effect and crit reduction were always just kinda flavor defensive effects anyway, and the only stat that mattered was the crit increase. In addition to these changes, the armor also had a shared glyph with the other two mage armors that just cut its cast time in half, and increase its defensive effects by 10%, which was mainly only taken by PvP mages who wanted to stance dance with their mage armors. In Warlords of Draenor, it was turned into a passive ability for fire mages only, so no longer needed to be casted. It also did the same thing, gave 5% crit buff and a 6% damage reduction from physical attacks. But early on in that expansion's life cycle, it was changed to instead give 15% more crit, which was a pretty big crit increase. In Legion, this spell only saw minor changes from its Warlords of Draenor counterpart before being removed entirely from the game in patch 7.1.5. With its removal, fire mages were given the Blazing Barrier ability, which absorbs damage and had the Fire Thorns effect when attacked, just like the old school Molten Armor did. There are even artifact weapon traits that give this new shield physical damage reduction, just like what Molten Armor used to provide as well. So while Molten Armor might be gone, Blazing Barrier is kinda the same. It's basically just a fiery version of Ice Barrier that mages have always had. So really, they didn't gain much other than some flavor theme abilities into the barrier now, with some minor fiery thorns damage to attackers, and a minor physical damage reduction as the barrier is not that big and gets absorbed very quickly. So these two defensive effects don't really apply for very long. Mage Armor was first added to the game in a very early patch of Vanilla WoW. In its first form, it increased all your magical resistances and allowed you to regen mana during combat at 30% the normal rate. Mana regen was based on spirit, and you did not regen mana at all while in combat, unless you didn't attack for 5 seconds. Then your spirit would kick in at 100% and start regenning, and this is why lots of casters eventually had to resort to wanding in Vanilla WoW. That way, they technically wouldn't be casting a spell, and could start to get some mana back, since mana was absolutely a thing casters had to manage and not just healers. And since the other two mage armors at the time provided only defensive benefits, Mage Armor was typically the most used mage armor in raids, even if mages generally had terrible spirit values, and only getting 30% benefit from it wasn't all that great. It was still better than 0. In the Burning Crusade, Mage Armor only saw minor changes not worth noting, as well as being made undispellable along with other mage armors. Also, since Molten Armor was added this expansion, there was actually some competition between which mage armor to use in raids, as Molten Armor gave a DPS benefit in the form of a 3% crit buff. In Wrath of the Lich King, Mage Armor saw some major buffs. Its 30% mana effect was increased to 50%, which could be increased a further 20% with a glyph. It was also given an additional defensive effect in addition to its Resist All, in the form of an effect, which reduced the duration of all harmful effects and debuffs by 50%. basically making it so dots only lasted half their duration on you. This effect completely shut down Shadow Priests and Warlocks in PvP, as a lot of their damage came from dots at this time. This was an incredibly powerful defensive effect that got nerfed regularly in future expansions. Around this time, Arcane Mages were finally established as a legitimate DPS spec once they were given Arcane Blast at the Burning Crusade, and their whole gimmick was that they could do massive amounts of damage if they had the mana to support it. So the mana regen nature of the spec was still in its early days, and giving Mage Armor such a huge improvement in mana regeneration was thought to help that further. Mages also had two other talents available to them at this time, Arcane Meditation and Pyromaniac, which both allowed 50% mana regeneration to continue while in combat. So, if you took both of those talents and used the Mage Armor glyph, you could have a theoretical 170% mana regeneration while in combat, because surprisingly, all of these abilities stacked additively. But seeing as the max was 100%, going up to 170% was redundant. Only, it still gave mana based on Spirit, and Spirit was a terrible stat for mages. It also barely showed up on mage gear, so there was not a lot to go around. So, even with the 170% mana back from Spirit in combat, it wasn't very good, which is why it got a much needed redesign in Cataclysm. In Cataclysm, Mage Armor was changed to grant 3% of your maximum mana every 5 seconds, instead of 50% Spirit regeneration. This change was great for Arcane Mages, as back in this time, Intellect still increased your maximum mana pool, and Int was on nearly all pieces of mage gear, was actually a useful stat for mages as it gave spell power and crit as well, and it increased as you got better and better gear. So, the more mage appropriate gear you got, the more mana you would regen, without having to take a dead stat like Spirit. It's basically how the armor should have worked from the start. Also, the glyph still increased the amount of mana the armor restored by 20%, making it give 3.6% mana every 5 seconds if glyphed. In addition, the mana cost to cast the armor was removed, and its incredibly powerful defensive effect was nerfed from providing 50% reduction in harmful effects to only 35%. And at 35%, it was still incredibly powerful, and still used by most mages who faced magical opponents in PvP, regardless of spec or if they needed the mana regen or not. In Mists of Pandaria, Mage Armor saw another redesign. This time, its mana regen effect was just completely removed, as it was in Mists that Blizzard made a firm stance that no casters should run out of mana during a raid fight, except Arcane Mages, but they also gave Arcane Mages more way to manage their mana so they wouldn't have to take Mage Armor for the mana effect, which wasn't there anymore. So instead of the mana effect, it now gave Mastery instead, with the other two Mage Armors giving crit and haste, basically making it so you just chose which Mage Armor you wanted based on which of those three stats you wanted most in raids. It was also changed with all the other Mage Armors to last forever and have a 3-second cast time to discourage stance dancing in PvP. Its all resist effect was removed completely, and finally, in a very early patch, its other defensive effect of reducing harmful magic effects was nerfed again, this time from 35% down to 25%, and was still pretty powerful. In Warlords of Draenor, Mage Armor was changed to a passive effect only available to Arcane Mages, but saw no other changes, unlike the other two armors, which saw redesigns to better fix their new exclusive spec status. Then, at the launch of Legion, Mage Armor saw 0 changes, until patch 7.1.5, when it was removed from the game, along with the other two Mage Armors. In its place, Prismatic Barrier was given to Arcane Mages to replace Ice Barrier. Prismatic Barrier is a bubble that gives Arcane Mages some effects similar to Mage Armor, as while it's up, you take 15% less magical damage, similar to its all-resist effect pre-mop, and it reduces magical effect durations by 25%, similar to its mop to legion power level of effect. But seeing as the amount of damage the bubbles absorbs is low, it goes away quickly, so you don't keep the defensive effects for very long. And that's it for the history of Mage Armor, and all Mage Armors in general.